Alrighty. So we should probably formally introduce ourselves to kick things off. My name is Maninda. I'm currently a third year medical student up in Brisbane. Before this, was doing a medical science degree, dabbled a little bit in the PhD, worked. So took a standard but a little bit circuitous route to get into med. Currently, it moved from Sydney to Brisbane for med. So at UQ and in my clinical year, so enjoying it a lot. So also happy to talk about anything kind of pre-med and that journey. Also kind of highlighting that probably Meg will talk about it a little bit as well. Like both of us are not your average kind of section one kind of archetypal students. Both of us have a science background, but did pretty well in section one. So it's definitely possible just because you haven't done an undergrad degree in arts as well. But yeah, that's me in my spare time. Don't have a lot of spare time at the moment, but otherwise do enjoy reading or like just kind of cafe hopping. Meghna?
That's an interesting hobby. No, I'm Meghna. So I think I've seen a few of your names before in some other webinars, but yeah, I co-manage section one with Maninda here at Fraser's, and I do dentistry at the University of Sydney. So yeah, I'm just on a little bit of a gap year at the moment. Just, trying to just take a break from uni. But yeah, like Maninda said, we aren't your classic philosophy graduates or anything like that. I did biomed and science at Deakin. I did honors at Monash. They were both in like developmental anatomy, so it was quite science heavy. But yeah, like hopefully that is sort of a relief for some of you, like who think that you need to be extremely well versed in a lot of books or a lot of philosophy or a lot of this and a lot of that to do well in section one. Hopefully today we can kind of prove to you that it's all about logic and reasoning, just like you would do in section three. And in terms of what I do in my free time, same boat as Maninda. I don't have a lot of free time, weird as it sounds. But yeah, I like to read, and I like to go exploring with family and friends. So I'm a pretty basic gal. Yeah.
Alrighty. So I think with regards to what today is, it's really an opportunity, hopefully, for us to clarify a little bit about what section one is, what it isn't. Also, if you guys have any questions you guys want about section one, more than happy to answer that as well. Just out of curiosity, if you guys don't mind chucking in the chat, have you guys sat the GAMSAT before, or would you guys be first time sitters? First time, sat it once, first time. All right, reasonable mix. I think also just to address that, hoping section one can help me, as I have very little formal science education. I don't think to be honest, sometimes the funny thing is they find that people that have done less science actually tend to sometimes do better in section three than people that have done science. That being said, I think it's definitely possible as well. I learned a little bit more in my section one and two than my section three. With regards to, maybe we'll start off then, since we have quite a lot of first time sitters, about what section one looks like. So currently it is 62 questions and you get 100 minutes to sit it. It's the first section of the exam, and you go straight from that into section two. You'll then get a break and go into section three. With regards to what those 62 questions are, they base it, or they organize it in terms of what we call kind of stems and questions, right? So a stem is a prompt that you'll get. So it might be a passage from a story, it might be a passage from a journal, it might be a diagram. And those will have anywhere from like 1 to 5, 6 questions sometimes associated with those. And basically the exams are, sorry, the not the exam, the section is based with a number of those stems. So in your experience, Megna, like how do you find kind of like what those stems are like, or where do those stems come from?
Sorry, what do you mean?
Like in terms of like, do you find there's any kind of patterns in terms of like where they get their stimulus from? Can it be anything? Are there like certain repeating kind of characteristics, things like that?
I think they can pretty much get them from anywhere, right? I've seen the most random texts appear
Hmm.
in my sittings, but also there's more and more repetition happening in the online GAMSAT as well. I feel like I've had students tell me, and even myself, I've noticed some stems repeat across like different sittings. Obviously, it's not an advantage or anything. I mean, who's really going to remember them? But yeah, like in terms of the diversity of the texts, you can get them from like scientific journals, from cartoons, from poems, famous poems, things like that. But yeah.
Definitely. I think saying that right, like what you find is and the ASA practice papers are a good source as well to kind of see what the kind of exam stems look like as well. Is there elements that like you tend to get, as Magna said, they can pull anything from anywhere, but there's certain, I think, overarching themes. Like you get a lot of nonfiction texts, you will get kind of poems consistently, you will get creative pieces consistently, you will get poetry consistently. When I say consistently, that's not to say that like every time the distribution of those is the same. One of the important things is that from sitting to sitting, the distribution of those within a particular exam will change. And even now that it's online, between different sitters in different areas, those will change as well, right? I think the value therefore then in kind of knowing things like that, right? And seeing not like specifically what comes up, right? But in general terms, the type of things comes up is that's really important in terms of how you prepare. So for example, as Magda said, you do get like one poem, for example, that might repeat over the course of years, right? But it's not like that's one poem and I don't know how many questions, right? It's not really useful in knowing how do I like break down and analyze that particular poem and know that inside and out. What is a more useful or more fruitful use of your time is understanding in principle, how do I read poetry? How do I understand poetry, right? That's the thing that's going to help you out more than how do I know this one specific thing. Similarly, like what's the best way I break down and understand nonfiction texts or things like that. Anything to add, Megna?
No, I think you covered it really well.
Easy. So that is the exam. That is the question. That's kind of like what the content of the exam can look like. Um, do you guys have any questions so far?
I think we have one. It seems to me from practice questions that section one is testing emotional and interpersonal intelligence. It is to a certain extent, but it's testing it through critical and logical thinking as well as plausible reasoning and things like that, right? So just kind of focusing purely on reading ethics or like getting used to medical ethics and things like that, that's really not going to help you with emotional or interpersonal intelligence. It might open your eyes to different issues, but those kinds of things only come through doing questions, actually thinking and changing the way you think as well. So I do see a lot of students tell me, oh, I read like 100 medical ethics journal articles in preparation for section one, and yet I only got like a 50 or a 55. That's kind of why those just reading for pleasure, or like reading in that way, doesn't teach that to you.
I think to also lead off from that question and also Christina's question next, which was, do you have any specific tips for analyzing plays, right? Is with regards to Mecca's question, there's certain questions that just aren't like, if it's like a diagram or it's an extract from like a law article or something like that, there's nothing being tested with regards to emotional or interpersonal intelligence there. It's a reading comprehension. Can you find and extract the relevant evidence based on what the question is asking? I think the parts where the emotional and interpersonal intelligence come in is for things like Christina's asked, plays, stories, poetry, right? Where there are people involved and there are these interpersonal interactions happening. And so to answer the question specific to plays, but I would say this applies to any kind of fiction, what piece of fiction, that is plays, poems, stories, etc., is what you're interested in there is what are the interactions between different characters, what are the interactions between the setting and the characters, and kind of reading between the lines, right? And I'll explain this because I know as a student, and when I was learning, reading between the lines used to be one of the most frustrating uh, things that was said. Like, it's like, how do you read between the lines? What does that mean? It's talking about implicit information there, right? It's like, so if I give you the statement, the man smiled at his wife, the man smiled at his wife lovingly, the man smiled at his wife menacingly, right? The actions or what is explicitly happening in all three of those examples is exactly the same, right? A man is always, there's a man, there's a woman, the man is smiling at her. But the tone or the nature of what is actually happening in the background changes based on those descriptors, right? No descriptor, a descriptor that's quite positive, so lovingly, or a descriptor that's quite negative. So generally with plays and these works of fiction, what you're being tested on is, can you follow these implicit or unspoken cues? So big advice is pay attention to things like adjectives and adverbs, right? How are things described? How are actions described? How do people relate to one another? And then just sometimes something as simple as keeping track of who's saying what in like plays is often very important. It's something that seems simple, but especially if it's a long passage, if you're tired, it can be something that's easily forgotten or overlooked. And that's where you can get confused or make silly mistakes, is if it was like Anthony that said something rather than like Jack, and like you're suddenly like going, what's going on? So just keeping a track of what's happening. And I find sometimes for those, the best thing is like, let it play out in your head like a movie and imagine what's happening as you read it. All right. Magda, do you want to maybe just talk about the exam timing a little bit out loud, or the ACE papers, what you wrote?
Um, in terms of the ASO papers.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, sure. If you're doing any sort of like preparation, you want to make it, especially because the GAMSAT is about, it's not that far away, it's about 6 weeks away. This is the time to do timed practice and to replicate the conditions of the exam as much as that you can. I don't think this is the time to go super lenient with yourself, because you're going to struggle as you get closer and closer to the exam to complete it in time and to make sure that your accuracy is high as well. So um, yeah, I would say don't do it in chunks. Do each section, and then do it like a mock exam as it's intended to as well. We do have another question. What would be a good resource to build good reading skills? I've heard a lot by Reading Theory and Stanford Encyclopedia. So I touched on this just a little while ago, but again, just reading widely is not something that will help you at all for section one. We will tell you that straight out now. Unless you have extreme sort of difficulties in reading, or you're just learning English and it's a completely new experience and language for you, it might help then. But to be honest, just reading without a purpose and without the focus of making it GAMSAT oriented is pretty, it's not really going to help that much at all.
So there was a question here which was quite good. I'm struggling to find, oh no, not that. How do you distinguish between answers? I find myself relating each answer back to the text, and they all seem to relate to the question, which makes it difficult to pick one choice. No, very, very valid question. And that's a little bit how the questions are set up, right? So going a little bit into kind of how questions are created in theory, right? The way a question generally is created, like the average question is created, this can kind of change depending on whether they want to make it easier or harder, is for multiple choice options. You have one answer option that has nothing at all to do with what the question is asking, right? Like the question is asking what color is the sky, and one of the answer options is zebra. Like you immediately look at it and go like, this is not what you're asking. This is not what you're asking me. There is another answer option that is perhaps quite wrong, maybe a little bit more closely related, but again, you should be able to eliminate or be like, this doesn't have much to do with what the question is asking, fairly easily. And the last two answer options are what we call kind of the classic 50-50. And those are two answer options that seem to be very similar, saying very similar things, almost identical. And you're left going in a creative exam or in a question that has a creative stimulus open to interpretation. How do I objectively pick what the correct answer is, right? So it might be something like, this text as a whole is described as sad versus what's the word I'm looking for? Magna, help me out. What's the sad word that comes up a lot that means like very sad?
Melancholy?
Yes, that is the one. Melancholy, right? Sad versus melancholy, and you go, hang on, those both mean sad. What do you want me to do with this, right? Now, there's a couple of things to keep in mind. The first is, what is the question actually asking, right? Because generally when you get down to those answers, whether it's the 50-50 or even if it's all four seem tricky, what specifically is the question asking? Is it asking for the text as a whole? Is it asking for a portion of the text? Is it asking for a character? What are the specific elements that the question is asking you for? And how does each specific element of the answer option relate back to that question? That's a key thing. The second thing is also ask yourself now, in that example I gave of sad versus melancholy, it's one word, right? But for those longer answer options, asking yourself, what are the differences between the answer options, right? Because fundamentally, there can only be one correct answer. The answer options actually have to be saying something different. So in the example of sad versus melancholy, it's a difference in intensity. So for example, sad is on kind of a spectrum of very positive to very negative. Sad's on the negative side, but it's closer towards neutral, whereas melancholy is actually close to very sad, right? And how do we use the difference? Well, it's saying, okay, what's the difference between, we know that melancholy is much more intense than sad. What did the question say? Okay, the question said, this text as a whole. Okay, so we know we need to look at the whole text. Why is that important? Well, there might have been only one part of the text that was actually only really sad. Like it was really, really sad, but it was only one small part. There was only 3 lines in like 20 lines of text that was actually really, really sad. And because it said the text as a whole, that means actually most of the text wasn't quote unquote super negative, right? So it's actually more accurate to say that, sorry about that. It's more accurate to say that that text was sad rather than melancholy. If it was flipped, let's say there were 3 really positive lines, but the rest of the text, or like 3 neutral lines and the rest of the text was really negative, the text overall was super negative. So you go for that more negative answer, right? So it's asking yourself, is there an intensity in the answer options that are presented? Is it a difference in scale? Like one answer option is correct, but only if you're talking about a very narrow part of the text, and the question's asking you to consider the text broadly. And then obviously accuracy in terms of how accurate. And section 1, we want to be very finicky. and precise with what the language is saying in terms of the answer option and what the text shows. So hopefully that does give a bit of an insight in terms of picking kind of and weeding down your answer options. Anything else, Magna, that popped up in the Q&A that was you wanted to kind of elaborate on?
Yeah, for sure. I think there was one about cartoons by Parnika. So a specific question, do you have any tips on how to better dissect cartoons? I've been practicing quite a lot. I find that my accuracy is very hit and miss. So yeah, definitely. So with cartoons, right? I think the first thing to kind of realize is there's such a big absence of text. It's you kind of have to put together all the meaning and everything within a line, a caption that's like 5 to 10 words long. So, they're not giving you a lot to go on. And to a certain extent, they do expect you to connect and put together a lot of visual concepts, right? That's why cartoons, diagrams, they tend to be very based on conceptual reasoning. So the first thing to do would be to make sure that you just get some more exposure to cartoons. And once you've kind of done that and you realize the pattern of how they draw them, what they draw them about. So a really useful resource is like New Yorker cartoons, right? So they get most of the cartoons from this magazine called The New Yorker. And you can just Google it. I'll just drop the link as well. Just give me 1 second. And you can use it to practice some cartoons. The next thing to kind of think about is, do you understand the link between the main theme of the cartoon and also the caption of the cartoon? Because a lot of the times the caption decides what the cartoon is going to be about. So you're getting most of your context, your thematic relevance, your argument, your tone, basically from the caption. So that's where I would say is a really easy way. It's a very straightforward way to get started. And once you get more and more accurate in relating the caption to the theme or the main point of the cartoon, you can start to build in things like time. You can start to build in, lots of other things as well. Yeah.
The Fraser's Interview Comprehensive course is designed to support you.
Was that me?
I think it may have been that or the ghost of Tom Spaulding is haunting this webinar.
Is Tom here? Oh, sorry. No, I don't think he is. I think I just had the website open. I'm so sorry, you guys. So for the free LMS, I will just drop a link in the chat. Give me 1 second. Yeah, cool. I think that's all the questions.
Mm-hmm. Other general things. Oh, yes. A big thing I know that stresses people out sometimes with section 1 is vocab. You don't need to memorize like a dictionary page every day, anything like that. In terms of useful things that people have found, right? If you're studying consistently, keeping a vocab list can help. So specific words that you don't know, making a list of that. Again, that's only really going to be helpful if you come back to that, right? And like regularly have a look and remind yourself. There's no point in just writing it down once and then never looking at it again. In terms of a common point, where what do you call it? In terms of a common resource I found that helps people like kind of understanding where you're at is if you Google image wheel of emotion, you get all these different things where it's kind of different intensities of words and then how words can be split into broad categories, right? Like it gives you like 5-10 different words for like sad at different intensities, and knowing the differences between those can help you as well. One of the key things I will say though is because everybody comes across words in section 1 on the exam day, in practice, whatever, that they have no clue about, right? And that's just part of what it is. It's part of the testing strategy they use, just to kind of throw unknowns in there and see kind of who panics. One of the key tenets of section 1 is focus on what you do know before you focus on what you don't. So in terms of a question context, right? Let's say there's one answer option word that you do know. A lot of the time it's super tempting to be like, oh crap, this must be the one, or this is that thing, right? I want you all to ignore that and focus on those other 3 answer options that you do know the meanings for, right? And what that means is you go through those 3. Because you know the meaning of those, you're able to work out, is this answer option correct or not? Now, if one of those answer options that you do know is correct, great, end of story, you found your answer option. If all 3 of those answer options are incorrect, then you know by process of elimination, it has to be that incorrect answer option. Sorry, not incorrect, unknown answer option, right? Do not be tempted to go, this is meant to be a smart exam for smart people. It must be this word, but I'm not smart enough to know. Absolutely not. Most of the time, it's in there for a trap. Same principle applies. It doesn't matter how many times. Let's say there are 3 words you don't know, right? And 1 word which you do. Again, don't panic. Start off with that word that you know. If you're lucky, and like potentially could be there just as a trap for people, it may well be that word that you did know, right? And you're like, sweet, I know what this is. This matches with what I'm looking for. I'm going to select this. Even if it's not, you've now reasonably eliminated your answer options to a 33% guess rather than completely panicking and skipping it, leaving it, or it being a 1 in 4 as well. And that same thing applies for even if you, well, what would you say? Like with reading a passage, right? You may not understand 2 or 3 sentences in a particular passage. That could be 2 or 3 sentences out of like 20 or 30, right? You'll still be able to understand most of what's happening. Don't let that lack of understanding a little bit completely buckle your confidence with regards to how you approach the whole paper.
I think as well, sometimes, as weird as it sounds, it's, you know, it's kind of it's one question as well, right? Like, don't think about spending too much time on it. So if you kind of feel like vocab is letting you down, or you're spending like 10 minutes on one question, just move on. I don't think it's really worth it to waste time and carry that stress with you from the next to the next to the next. So yeah.
Too easy. Do you have any advice regarding analyzing text without being able to annotate text on paper? Oh, very good question. So I think with regards to the use of paper, right, I think it's a little bit of a misnomer in that even if you did have paper, the strategies in terms of analyzing the text doesn't fundamentally change. Also, I think you are given, you do get a sheet of paper, right? Yeah, you get your sheet of paper. The key thing about analyzing the text is active reading, right? So what I mean by that is you want to be reading it out loud in your head as you go and kind of almost commentating to yourself what's happening as you go along, right? So it's kind of like, it was a gloomy sky. Bob the fisherman came in at last to the shore after a grueling 6 months, right? You read that and you're like, okay, there's this character Bob, 6 months he's been gone. It was difficult, and according to the description, it's like a dark day, like it's a bad day. The vibes are a bit off, right? And it's kind of as you read through, making those mental notes to yourself. With regards to the annotation on the piece of paper, what I want you guys to be asking yourself is, why am I writing down what I'm writing down, right? Because remember, the key thing is you have a limited amount of time. It's going to take you additional time to write stuff down, and you have the text in front of you, right? There's no limit to how many times you can go back and look for information. And this is another thing, guys, when you're picking your answer options, you want to be checking is there evidence for the answer option I'm picking? Do not read it once, be like, I've read it, okay, I'm going to try remember and just pick what the answer option is, right? You can go back, like the text is right there. Go back, check, do I have evidence for this or not? Obviously, a little bit slow at the start, you will pick up speed as you keep practicing. But remember, you can always go back and look up a piece of information. So if you are writing something, like writing down a note from it about a particular piece of information, you need to ask yourself why, because the key thing is you can go back and look at it. If it's a really long, complicated text, sure. If you want to write down a sentence that summarizes paragraph 1, 2, 3, 4, or something like that. If it is a particularly complicated thing that you want to draw it out as a diagram or summarize a really confusing double negative or statement, again, that's something that's fine. But fundamentally, the analysis and understanding of the text doesn't change whether you have paper or not. It's actively reading it and kind of explaining it to yourself as you go, or pretend you're explaining it to somebody else. The paper is there to help you unravel or note down particularly complicated things or things that you want to remember that might be difficult to recall immediately. Hopefully that answered that. Any other questions? Oh.
I think there's one. Would you suggest reading the questions before the text or vice versa? Always the text before the questions. You don't, yeah, like GAMSAT is not a test where you can kind of go back and forth over and over. You'll waste a lot of time. So definitely read the text properly and then go to the questions.
I think the danger is also if you read the text first, you can kind of bias yourself and give yourself blindness to what the information that you're looking for is. With regards to slow reading, unfortunately, that is something that just comes with practice. So, sorry. That is something I would say definitely dedicate some time to in terms of just practicing to increase your reading speed. Like that can be like just valid practice, right? Half an hour every day, practice just reading something. And that's an example where it doesn't matter what you read, just read something and practice getting that speed up. How do you approach poetry? Again, poetry, fiction, stage plays, all of that much the same, right? You're looking at what is explicitly happening. So kind of ask yourself, who are the characters involved here? What are they like kind of, I'm talking going back to middle school, right? Like who, what, where, when, why, how? Like ask yourself those questions, try to answer those, and then look again at the implicit stuff. How are things described, right? Poetry at the end of the day is just a very, very short story with a few odd, wacky conventions, right? That make it poetry. For example, classic thing in poetry, you don't stop reading until you hit punctuation. That throws a lot of people off because they'll stop reading naturally at the end of the line, start reading something else, and the next time be like, hang on, how does this work? You're meant to read it through as if it was all written on one line. Also, a lot of great resources out there, YouTube stuff, right? Like just basic, how do I understand poetry will give you a lot of things. But for me, it's basically that because it's a short story, kind of ask myself, who are the characters involved? Where's it happening? What is happening? What are those interactions? And then how is that described? Yeah, no, nobody likes Shakespeare except Megna, maybe. And her opinion's incorrect.
Why would you not? No, like no, he's great. I will not back down from that. Yeah. Disappointed.
In you, yes.
You want to go down that road?
Yes. Shall I start listing the disappointment?
Oh, this webinar is going to turn into something else. Oh, I think that's all the questions I can see in the.
In that case, we hope this will. Oh, I mean, I haven't. Oh. Um. That might be actually something to speak to Acer about, because if that is the case, you might be able to get some genuine like medical considerations as well, Mecca, for sure. Like if you can get some if you can get doctors documentation doing that and email Acer and ask them for specific considerations, I think that would be very valid. Nah, I don't know. I think it's worth giving them an email for sure.
ACE's function is just to conduct the GAMSAT. They don't have any right to tell you whether you can do this or you can do that. If they can give you special consideration, they will, but they have no impact on whether you should be admitted or not past just a GAMSAT score. That's all.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Fingers crossed for the application. Yep. Oh yeah, Mal said there's an option where you can submit for medical exemption even after applying. Awesome. Thank you.
I was on mute. Where should I begin my preparation? I feel that going straight to the questions is a little bit tough. I'm not 100% sure what you mean by that, sorry. Like just doing practice questions is a bit tough. Okay. In terms of that, there's a lot of different things you can do. So the first thing would be to work on like your reading speed, right? Do like some speed reading courses. They're free online. There's a lot of free ones online that you can try to increase your reading speed. But to be honest with you, the best way is to get started on questions and then work backwards and find the areas and the text types that you're weak at. So I do understand it can be daunting, but it can also be extremely informative on where you actually need to spend time and where you don't need to spend time. And it gives you a good idea as to what to expect and what you're getting into as well. So yeah, those two would be the best way to go.
I think echoing Magna, definitely it's not a fun thing, especially when you're not sure you're starting out something new. You do something and just get like absolutely slammed with the questioning. But it's one of those things where there's no amount of theory that can actually replicate practice. Like you do need to get in there, get your hands dirty, get things wrong, and kind of improve from there onwards, right? And like getting stuff wrong, like especially when you're getting a lot of things wrong, like absolutely sucks and can feel very demotivating. But I think the important thing to realize there is that's not where you're ending up, right? This is like at the start of your journey, and it's about building from that point. Like the more you get wrong, I sometimes actually look at it as a positive, because that means there's so many different areas and little things that you can do to improve and move up from there. Sometimes when you're not getting a lot wrong, yes, it's a great place to be at, but also it makes improvement very, very frustrating because there isn't a lot you can do sometimes. Did you want to tackle the improvement one, Magna, in terms of questions? How should you approach reviewing your answers and questions you get incorrect?
Yes, sure. So that is called reflection, right? And we strongly recommend you use as much reflection as possible. And the way to kind of do that is not only think about what answers you got incorrect, but to also think about what answers you got correct, right? Because you always want to do things, or you want to get things right for the right reasons. Getting something right because you randomly guessed or you just got lucky, that's not something you can replicate in the exam, right? GAMSAT has been built to be very luck resistant, because you obviously just don't want people to luck their way into med. But in terms of what type of strategies you can improve, the first thing is to actually log the questions. Like you can use our question log as like a basic format of, I got this wrong. This is what type of text it was. This is why I got it wrong. and maybe I shouldn't do this next time. And that way you have like an entire list and you have an entire log of mistakes that you make most often, and you can change them pretty quickly, or at least you'll know pretty quickly, right? Another way as well is to actually like map out your thinking. So that's something I really like to do with my students, is just kind of explain how you got to an answer with a tutor, and say like, oh, this is what I was thinking. This is how I interpreted the text. Am I right? Am I wrong? And it's really useful to have someone to like bounce ideas with and bounce like processes with as well. So those are two really good ways. The first one is to log your questions, and another one is to have someone who's actually experienced in section one, experienced in GAMSAT, across the board, and just kind of have a chat with them and go, look, this is how I'm solving it. I'm not always getting it right. What can I do to solve this better? So those would be my two suggestions.
I think also sometimes asking yourself, along with that reflective practice, where tracking kind of where you're getting it wrong. Like, was it a mistake I made because I didn't read closely enough in the original stem? Is it a mistake because I didn't read the question closely enough? Is it a mistake because I'm not reading my answer options consistently enough? And you'd be surprised how many times it's like it's somewhere in there, right? Like where I've had people being like, oh, I just need to spend like an extra 10 seconds actually reading and dissecting what the question was asking me, or like I'm messing up the answer options because I'm not going back and actually looking for evidence. And they're doing that consistently. And once they fix that, there's actually an improvement.
Definitely. How long should you study every day and how many questions? So that's a very subjective thing. It depends on, all the different commitments you have in your life. It depends on, day-to-day circumstances as well. But to be honest with you, it's about quality, not quantity. I have seen people do complete question banks of like multiple different companies and do like thousands of questions, but they don't end up doing well in the GAMSAT. And again, it's just because they're just ticking it off, right? They're not actually focused on learning skills. They kind of treat it as content learning, and it's completely different to that. So there's no right or wrong answer on how much you should study, or how many questions you should do. It depends on you, and it depends on what you need to kind of improve day to day and section to section.
I think also quality over quantity and consistency is the other thing. You're better off consistently, like if you're better off doing like 3 sessions of section 1 every week and being able to maintain that consistently, rather than doing like every couple of weeks like a whole day of section 1, right? It doesn't translate. You want small consistent levels of engagement with the content, because that's how you retain and improve. And the other thing is, have a purpose when you sit down to study, right? Don't just sit down and be like, I am going to sit down and do some section 1 study. What are you going to do? Are you going to focus on a specific type of text? Are you going to focus on a specific goal of like getting through like stems quickly enough? Like essentially have a goal that you set yourself every time you sit down to study, so you know what you're aiming towards. Any other questions?
I don't think we do have any other questions, no.
Yeah.
Cool. Are we doing any practice questions? No, this is not a webinar where we do questions. This is more of just like a deep dive into the humanities. So if you want stuff like that there, you can join our free LMS and you can find recordings of like our masterclasses and other events where we've actually gone through like texts and questions. So I've posted the link in the chat. I might just do it again. Where is it? Yeah, We won't be doing questions today, no. And with the link, just something to do is, once you've joined, press join group so that you can access all the resources in it as well. So yeah, Mika, you just have to press join group, like that little button that comes up, and then you'd be able to see all the resources. In terms of what text type comes up the most, that would be sort of like the nonfiction text types that come up the most. Yeah. So think like your journal articles and things like that.
Journal articles, like what's the name? Like Sapiens, like basically kind of like philosophy pieces, like as well, like those kind of things. The ASA question papers will actually give you a good idea of what we mean when we say like nonfiction and the range of things that they look at. I think here, so I would be starting from scratch, but do I have enough time if I start now? A little bit asking how long is a piece of string. It's difficult, right? Because it depends on what your goals are and what your baseline kind of is. We're in, what are we? We're July 22nd, August, September. You have just over a month and a bit. I think absolutely that is enough time to actually make some meaningful improvements if you are kind of consistent with your study and you have a plan kind of going forward. So yes, like obviously I'd be lying if I was like, yes, it's like the exact same as starting like 3 months out, but like no, like over a month is still a meaningful period of time. Absolutely. I think it just means you have to be a lot more intense and focused with your study and your preparation. Oh, sorry, no, go on.
Oh, no, I was just like looking at the comments, sorry.
Would you recommend prepping beyond 3 months with phrases? It's a little bit hard purely because I feel like with some of the course packages, do you know how long you have access to the question bank for when you get it?
Yeah, so for our question bank, you'll have access to it for 2 sittings.
Okay, so 6 months. Yeah, so I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. Prepping for beyond 3 months. I think that the basis for the 3 months is kind of, that's like, if you're doing everything and you're kind of doing it consistently, 3 months should be enough time. But I think if you want a slower and more gradual runway into it, like going for more than 6 months is fine. But just make sure if you're going with the phrases package, like how long the components of that package are. Like, so don't get something assuming you're going to have it for next March if it's going to be gone after the September sitting. So definitely clarify those details beforehand, at least with just a question bank. If you want to start getting into questions and get a feel for it, that should be fine. As Magda said, they're there for 2 seasons or 6 months. Even for a non-science, look, I think if you are a non-science person, then definitely a little bit long is probably on the safer side, especially for section 3. Unfortunately, you are talking to the wrong 2 people for section 3 advice. But no, I think definitely going for a bit longer than 3 months is probably a good idea. And have a look out there in terms of what people have done for section 3 study as well, if there's anything that resonates with you or that might be useful as well. I'll also, before we leave, just chuck my email in the chat. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to reach out.
I'll just chuck mine down as well. So definitely let us know if you have any questions, not just related to section 1, even though that's kind of our specialty, but if you have any wider GAMSAT questions as well, please do let us know. And, you know, we're more than happy to help, and we're more than happy to, you know, do the best we can to help you, because we've been in your shoes as well. We've been through the multiple sitting or like first time sitting, and, you know, wondering how things are going to go, wondering about this, wondering about that. So yeah.
For sure. But otherwise, thank you so much, guys, for joining us on a Saturday night. I know probably not everybody's cup of tea or the place they want to be, but no, we appreciate it.